Today I'll be discussing the largest airborne operation you probably have never heard of. The setting is towards the end of World War II, where the war no longer became about tackling Germany, but which country could enter Berlin first. With lessons learned from Operation Market Garden and Operation Overlord, the Allies wanted to put the use of mass airborne assaults to the test. This is the story of Operation Varsity. Operation Varsity would take place on the 24th of March 1945, towards the end of the war. By March, the Allies had reached the Rhine, which was the last major hurdle until the Allies could branch out throughout the North German plain and towards Berlin. Crossing the Rhine would mean the Allies would pretty much be at the last stage of the war, as the Rhine stretched through the Rhineland, which was a major part of the war zone, especially during World War I, as well as World War II. After the Rhine was crossed, the Allies would finally be beyond the funnel, or kill zone, that was that area of Europe. So, the Allies along the Rhine now prepared to make a large crossing, and break the German line that was waiting on the opposite end of the enormous river. Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery, commanding his Canadian 21st Army Group, came up with the operation code Operation Plunder. Operation Varsity would be a part of this enormous operation to breach the stalemate of the Rhine. Eisenhower reviewed the plan, which was to take the British 2nd Army and the US 9th Army over the Rhine towards Wesel, a large city within Germany, and this would be the base of a further spearhead through the German line. Eisenhower reluctantly approved, and so the enormous assault into the core of Germany could be planned further. These armies couldn't simply march over the bridges of Wesel, as it would face heavy artillery and a concentration of German tank and infantry divisions. So Montgomery devised the use of airborne units to support the 2nd and 9th amphibious assault across the Rhine. This support operation was codenamed Operation Varsity, with 3 airborne divisions initially chosen, that being the British 6th Airborne Division and the 13th and 17th U.S. Airborne Divisions. The British 6th Airborne was an experienced division, taking part in Operation Overlord. The 13th U.S. Airborne Division, however, was brand new, only participating in the Ardennes, which was not a combat drop. The 13th also lacked the gliders needed for the large assault, and it was concluded they could not join the American 17th and the British 6th in Operation Varsity. The other division, the 17th, only briefly faced combat. However, she was better equipped. This lack of experienced troops beyond the British 6th would result in a higher casualty rate, and has been criticized by a minority of historians as a waste of airborne troops. However, the reason for the enormous drop was to prove the airborne division's capabilities further as a quick reaction force that can be used right behind the enemy lines and surround the enemy. Although Operation Overlord was a success for airborne units and their reputation, the haunting of the failure of Market Garden still haunted a lot of military leaders' minds. Operation Market Garden was a failure of an invasion of the Netherlands, with airborne units suffering 2 to 3 times the casualty rate of the enemy. Needless to say, leaders like Montgomery wanted to further the point that airborne units are the next step of warfare. Montgomery saw the Germans' incredible use of airborne units, aka Fallschirmjäger, during the invasion of Crete, and knew the Allies could adapt such tactics during Operation Varsity and further into the century. The remaining troops involved in Operation Varsity, the British 6th and US 17th, now had a replan to accommodate the lack of an entire division. The decision was made to land around Wesel, where they would take out enemy defenses that could halt the main army's advances. The troops would be dropped near the village of Hammenkilde, where they would take the village and then the Dias Forter Wald, a forest that had a clear view of the Rhine. The Germans had been observed to use the foliage to hide their artillery. The forest also had a road running through that was a supply route between nearby villages. This would also need to be taken. The airborne divisions would also have to take the river Issel alongside nearby bridges in order to halt any flanks. After taking these objectives, they would wait for the ground units to link up for them. This assault was unique for 3 reasons. Firstly, it was a drop of a large scale, but the airborne were not dropped far from their friendlies. This tactic was to prevent a repeat of events like Operation Market Garden, where units like the British 1st Airborne were almost entirely wiped out since they were so isolated. Secondly, the main operation, Operation Plunder, would have the main ground units already attacking as the gliders sailed above. This was to distract the enemies and not allow any delays for enemy reinforcements to arrive. And finally, Operation Plunder and Varsity were day operations, as opposed to most, which include night drops. This was to benefit the ground units, but also the airborne, who were known to land far off course, just like in Operation Overlord. Instead of having small numbers scattered, airborne units could be concentrated and actually see objectives, another tactic the Fallschirmjäger used previously. The Airborne Assault would be the largest single-lift airborne operation during World War II, and would be an interesting test to see if airborne units could be dropped after their main assault and still be successful. The single-lift factor meant all troops were dropped pretty much all at once, ensuring nobody was left alone, and supplies could follow shortly after. It is important to recognize the German involvement in this story, as they only had a force around 8,000, one half of the Allied strength. And by this time in the war, the German troops were mostly young and tired of fighting, and also far less in numbers and in strength. The most formidable opponent of the German Reich in the area was the 1st Paratrooper Army, with small and weak divisions stationed along the landing zone and river. The Germans were low on everything: munitions, manpower, and food. The Germans had around 150 armored fighting vehicles in the area, as well as 114 and 712 light AA guns, more than 6 times the number the week before. As well as a week prior, Allies strafed local Luftwaffe airfields and supply routes. Needless to say, the Germans were weak, and a lack of intelligence resulted in them being on the verge of collapse. The German units did not even know the attack was going to take place until it already begun. Literally. So enough prepping, let's get into the actual battle. Operation Plunder started around 9 p.m., with Allied ground units securing crossings all over the eastern bank of the Rhine. During the early morning, the second phase, Operation Varsity, was launched. Airborne units launched from France and England, rendezvousing over Brussels, and then going towards their respective drop zones near the German section of the Rhine. The 17th Airborne consisted of around 9,387 personnel, and the British 6th Airborne consisted of around 7,220 personnel, both using a mix of transport, gliders, and troop carrier aircraft. The Allied Armada droned over the sky, stretching over 200 miles, with over 2,000 Allied fighters escorting them. I couldn't imagine what this looked like. All I could think of is the flight of the Valkyries seen from Apocalypse Now, or maybe the Spanish Armada of 1588. Just a spam of true firepower and strength. By 10 a.m., Brits and Americans were flooding the rolling hills of the area around the Rhine, some 13 hours after the main armies. The British 6th were the first to drop. The division dropped 9 minutes early, but still made it to their drop zone, despite already being lit up by small arms and anti-aircraft fire. The gliders used were weak but effective, and soon enough the British 6th were pouring into the Hammenkine area. Per usual, casualties were high at first, with rallying zones being heavily bombed by heavy enemy artillery. Eventually, though, British LZs were cleared, and the River Issel's bridges were secured, alongside Hammenkiln. The objectives were secured pretty fast, also probably due to the fact that American paratroopers missed LZ marks and ended up scattered with the Brits. The US paratroopers weren't as lucky as their allies, with smoke and miscommunication scattering the 17th Airborne. The British were also scattered, but the Americans were miles away from where they were supposed to be. However, with the Brits clearing the river and the Hammenkiln, it was pretty easy to see artillery as the next target, as it was still shooting hundreds of shells towards them, most artillery being located in the Diaz Fota forest. By 2 a.m. the forest was taken, and the artillery as well as tanks being cleared from the area. Private George Peters, part of the 507th Regiment, the lead regiment of the 17th Airborne, gained the Medal of Honor. Here is his citation. Private Peters, a platoon radio operator within G Company, made a descent into the German near Fleuren, east of the Rhine. With 10 others, he landed in a field about 75 yards from a German machine gun supported by riflemen, and was immediately pinned down by heavy direct fire. The position of the small unit seemed hopeless, with men struggling to free themselves of their parachutes in a hail of bullets that cut them off from their nearby equipment bundles. When Private Peters stood up, without orders, and began a one-man charge against the hostile emplacement, armed only with rifle and grenades, his single-handed assault immediately drew the enemy fire away from his comrades. He had run halfway to his objective, pitting rifle fire against that of the machine gun, when he was struck and knocked to the ground by a burst. Heroically, he regained his feet and struggled onward. Once more, he was torn up by bullets, and this time he was unable to rise. With a gallant devotion to his self-imposed mission, he crawled directly into the fire that had mortally wounded him, until close enough to hurl grenades, which knocked out the machine gun, killing 2 of its operators, and drove protecting riflemen from their positions into the safety of the woods. By his intrepidity and supreme sacrifice, Private Peters saved the lives of many of his fellow soldiers and made it possible for them to reach their equipment, organize, and seize their first objective. Another infantryman would also gain the Medal of Honor in the 17th Airborne. Private First Class Stuart Stryker led a charge against a machine gun nest, sacrificing himself as a distraction for his comrades to take over the fortified position. All objectives were captured: the forest, the Isles bridges, the supply route, and the Hemmenkelland village. All these protected the main Operation Plunder's infantrymen, and no supplies, reinforcements, or counterattacks could be made by the Germans. This made the largest single-lift airborne invasion an enormous success. By March 27th, 12 bridges were erected over the Rhine, giving the Allies the space they needed to flood into the heart of Germany. The German general major of the opposition said the defending Germans were shocked by the speed and effect of the airborne divisions. It seems Montgomery's hopes for a replication of the Fallschirmjäger were a success. However, airborne units would never become the next generation of warfare, like he might have hoped. As effective as it is, the casualty rate is too high, which brings me to the counterpoint. Many strategists believe airborne units suffered too many casualties to be worth it. Instead, those divisions could be infantry and help the main spearhead. I'm not sure who is right. The airborne are super badass and effective, but the casualty rates are super high. So let's get into the numbers. Out of over 16,000 airborne units, around 2,500 were dead or wounded in Operation Varsity. On the German side, out of 8,000, 3,500 were captured, and casualty rates were high, but unknown. I estimate it's in the thousands. The airborne operation was also during the day, which only made things worse, in my opinion. Smoke and haze made it difficult to navigate, so time of day does not change the difficulty of finding drop zones in combat. Despite the casualties, I feel this operation deserves a voice. It's practically unknown. I couldn't even find an excerpt in the History of World War II books I have. I think it's important we recognize this operation, as it represents the final months for Germany, and the use of airborne units outside the failure of Market Garden and the success of Operation Overlord. To have thousands be involved and thousands die without any notice didn't seem right, so hopefully you learned something new. Anyways, hopefully you enjoyed this one. Expect another video this week. I spent the first half of this week watching the show The Pacific, and just today I watched the movie Miracle about the 1980 hockey team. I suggest both of them, especially the Pacific. The Pacific gets shit for not being as good as Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers, but I love the Pacific a lot. It shows the grit and reality of the Pacific theater. Anyways, enough babbling. Have a good day.